Canadian Grant Murray had made up his mind. He was done with the United States. Like millions of his fellow Canadians, the 62-year-old Vancouver lawyer had been boycotting America ever since Trump started threatening Canada's economy with crippling tariffs and insulting rhetoric about making Canada the 51st state.
We're getting, as you know, as of November 1st, I could move it up if I wanted, a 100% tariff over and above what we get now. So that would make it about 157%. And China doesn't want that, and they want to talk, and we're talking. And I think we'll make a deal that will be good for both. I think we will do something. But you have to understand, we never got anything from China. It was a one-way street. For many years, for decades, it was a one-way street. And they became rich because of the United States. And frankly, presidents that, let's be nice, they didn't know. They just didn't know. They didn't understand what was happening to them.
But there he was, standing in Seattle's T-Mobile Park, clutching a $280 ticket to watch his beloved Toronto Blue Jays take on the Mariners in Game 3 of the American League Championship Series. This story reveals something fascinating about the current state of U.S.-Canada relations under Trump's renewed presidency. The president's aggressive trade stance has created a diplomatic crisis between two nations that have historically been the closest of allies. His threats to impose sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods during his first day in office, if Ottawa does not curb the flow of undocumented migrants and illegal drugs into the United States, have sent shockwaves through both economies. But it wasn't just the economic threats that angered Canadians, it was Trump's repeated suggestion that Canada should become the 51st state, comments that caused Prime Minister Trudeau and others to laugh nervously at first, with Trump continuing to tell Trudeau that he could still be governor of the 51st state. These remarks have struck at the very heart of Canadian national identity. Canadian leaders have struggled to formulate an approach to these unprecedented economic threats. The debate has divided the country's political establishment, with some advocating for immediate retaliation, while others counsel patience and continued dialogue. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has emerged as one of the most vocal advocates for a strong response, meeting with the new Prime Minister Mark Carney at his home to discuss potential retaliatory measures. The impact on U.S. tourism has been substantial and immediate. In 2024, there were 20.4 million visits from Canada, generating $20.5 billion in spending and supporting 140,000 American jobs. The Tourism Association warns that a 10% reduction in Canadian travel could mean 2 million fewer visits, $2.1 billion in lost spending, and 14,000 job losses. In Seattle specifically, the tourism agency is forecasting a 26% drop in international tourism, RISM, for 2025, which is largely made up of Canadian visitors. Canadians spent $586 million in the Seattle area in 2024, representing 60% of international visitor spending. The Canadian auto manufacturing sector has been particularly vulnerable to Trump's trade policies.
Huge industry, they'll make it through. It's going to be tough, they'll make it through. Quebec, aluminum, huge industry, they'll make it through. The Americans don't have enough aluminum, they'll make it through. I'm with Lisa on this one. Automakers, the automobile manufacturing sector as a whole is so huge to the Canadian economy. If it continues like this, that will have a determining effect on all of the country. And, one plant in one city, 3,000 direct jobs, 3,000 families without a livelihood potentially, but then everything else in a ripple effect, all the indirect jobs. That's one factory, and there are many. So it is a huge concern as they're negotiating right now in the United States. This has to be top of mind. But it wasn't. Lutnick was directly saying, Lisa's right, her quote is right, Lutnick is clear as a bell. They're going after the Canadian automobile industry as a whole. And I think we've got to be lucid about what that means to us. We keep talking about Trump and the effect of this. This is huge. This is the big one. Automobile is the big one. And I think that, you're right, Vashti. I mean, let's hope that there's something in the budget. But let's hope that there's not something in the budget that goes back to the old game of the government trying to pick who the winners are in a free market. That's been proven to be a huge mistake. Benzie was talking about the plants that are still on tap in Ontario.
The industry represents thousands of direct jobs and countless more in the supply chain, making it a critical component of Canada's economy. Trump's Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has explicitly targeted the Canadian automobile industry, with experts calling this the big one among trade concerns. The pressure has intensified as companies like Stellantis consider moving production to the United States to avoid potential tariffs. Political opposition parties have mounted fierce criticism of Canada's response to these tariffs.
Still no win, still no elbows, and the only thing that's up are American tariffs on Canada since the Prime Minister took office. After his humiliating meeting in the White House last week, the President sensed weakness in Mark Carney and decided to have his Commerce Secretary announce that the auto tariffs would be permanent and to jack up lumber tariffs another 10%. Mark Carney's broken promises and weakness abroad are costing Canadian workers at home. I'm calling on Mark Carney again. Keep your word. You promised you would negotiate a win and get us a deal by July 21st. Those lumber and auto workers and the workers behind me today are counting on Mark Carney to keep his promise and to do it now.
Conservative voices argue that the government has broken promises to Canadian workers by failing to secure a trade deal despite assurances that they would stand up to Trump. They point to increased tariffs on lumber and the auto sector as evidence that the current diplomatic approach has failed to protect Canadian interests. The 51st state comments have been particularly inflammatory for Canadian citizens. The majority of the reason why people are avoiding the U.S. right now has to do with the tariffs and the 51st state comments, with talk of the 51st state seeming to be where people are making a much more firm decision about not going to the United States. A poll in January found 90% of Canadians opposed the idea, though 52% of Canadians believed the American president was trolling, seeking attention, compared to 32% who took him seriously. But here's where the story gets interesting: the power of sports to transcend politics. Grant Murray represents thousands of Canadian Blue Jays fans who made an exception to their U.S. boycott for baseball. Like many Canadians, Murray has been boycotting the U.S. since the Trump administration started threatening Canada's economy and sovereignty, but he made an exception for baseball this week and paid $280 for a standing room only ticket, though he's not drinking the beer and refuses to spend the night in a Seattle hotel. Murray's approach was strategic: minimize spending while still supporting Canada's only MLB team. He drove more than 6 hours round trip rather than stay overnight, bought the cheapest ticket he could find, and planned to spend as little as possible. This wasn't the leisurely baseball vacation he used to take. In previous years, Murray would make special multi-day trips to Seattle, spending 5 times as much money enjoying Washington State. Now, his visit was purely functional: get in, watch the game, get out. The broader context here is Trump's negotiating strategy. Analysts say this approach echoes the trademark negotiating style that Trump has employed for many years, both in business and the presidency. A former economic advisor says the president-elect is aiming to get leverage in renegotiating the three-way trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. But Trump's tactics appear to be having unintended consequences. Rather than bringing Canada to the negotiating table from a position of weakness, the threats have actually strengthened Canadian national unity. A recent Angus Reid analysis found that the proportion of Canadians saying they are very proud of their country jumped by 10 percentage points from 34 to 44% between December and February, while the percentage of people who said they want Canada to join the U.S. also dropped from 6 to 4%. The Canadian response has been politically significant too. Trudeau's Liberal Party had been trailing the center-right Conservative Party by a huge margin, with a Nanos poll in mid-January giving the Conservatives a 27-point lead. But the polling deficit has now been all but eradicated, with a new poll showing the Liberals just 1 point adrift. The new Liberal leader, Mark Carney, a former central banker who won the race to succeed Trudeau and could be sworn in within days as the new prime minister, has sounded a defiant tone in response to Trump's tariff moves, saying America is not Canada and Canada never, ever will be part of America in any way, shape, or form. What's particularly fascinating about the Blue Jays phenomenon is how it demonstrates the complexity of cultural relationships that transcend politics. MLB reports there are 15.8 million Blue Jays fans across Canada, over half of whom live outside of Ontario, representing the largest single fan base of any Canadian professional sports team. This creates a situation where political anger conflicts with deep cultural loyalty. Seattle businesses have felt the impact acutely. Bob Donegan, president of Ivar's, an iconic Seattle seafood restaurant, described tracking the steady drop in Canadian tourists as depressing. They were so missed that Donegan led a local tourism campaign in May with other local businesses offering them specials, discounts, and goodwill to entice them back. Donegan says he's hopeful the playoffs will now be a turning point for Canadian tourism in Seattle. The geographic proximity between British Columbia and Washington State makes this relationship particularly important. Vancouver and Seattle have long had close ties, with Canadians regularly crossing the border for shopping, dining, and entertainment. The fact that even this relationship is being strained shows the depth of Canadian frustration with Trump's approach. Rhiannon McMillan, a 36-year-old electrician from Maple Ridge, BC, called the Blue Jays-Mariners matchup "my dream series," since she's a fan of both teams. Her comment that, "either way, I can't lose," highlights how sports can provide a refuge from political tensions, creating moments of joy even amid broader conflicts. The broader trend shows Canadians redirecting their travel spending. Travel consultants have seen a shift to Canadians booking trips to Mexico, Europe, Iceland, and Asia instead of the United States. This represents a significant economic shift that could have lasting implications for the U.S. tourism industry, particularly in border states. What makes this story particularly relevant is how it illustrates the human cost of political rhetoric. Trump's 51st state comments, which he may view as negotiating tactics or even jokes, have real economic consequences for American businesses and workers who depend on Canadian tourism. The Seattle area alone could lose hundreds of millions in revenue if the 26% projected drop in Canadian visitors materializes. The irony is that Trump's pressure tactics may be achieving the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of making Canada more dependent on the United States, they're encouraging Canadians to diversify their economic relationships and strengthen their national identity. The surge in Canadian pride and the political rally around the flag effect suggest that external pressure is unifying rather than dividing the country. For Grant Murray and thousands of other Canadian Blue Jays fans, the decision to attend games in Seattle represents a fascinating compromise, maintaining cultural connections while minimizing economic support. They're essentially saying they value the shared love of baseball while rejecting the broader political relationship. This dynamic could have implications for how both countries approach future negotiations. Canada is demonstrating that it has economic leverage too, the ability to redirect billions in tourism spending elsewhere. Meanwhile, the United States is learning that its cultural soft power, while strong, isn't unlimited when it comes into conflict with respect for sovereignty. The story also highlights the Pacific Northwest's unique position in U.S.-Canada relations. The deep ties between British Columbia and Washington State, built over decades of shared interests and regular interaction, are being tested by national political conflicts. Whether these relationships can weather the current storm may depend on how long the political tensions persist. As this situation develops, it will be interesting to see whether other cultural connections, like hockey, shared environmental concerns, or business relationships, prove as resilient as baseball fandom. The Blue Jays fans crossing the border for playoff games may represent the last thread of normalcy in a relationship that's become increasingly strained by political rhetoric and economic threats. The ultimate question is whether Trump's negotiating strategy will achieve its intended goals, or whether it will permanently damage one of America's most important bilateral relationships. For now, the sight of Canadian fans grudgingly paying for expensive tickets while refusing to buy beer tells the story of a relationship under severe stress, held together only by the thinnest threads of shared culture and mutual affection.